Welcome, everyone, to Family Talk. It's a ministry of the James Dobson Family Institute, supported by listeners just like you. I'm Dr. James Dobson, and I'm thrilled that you've joined us.
Well, welcome to Family Talk. I'm Roger Marsh. If you've seen a headline over the past couple of weeks or even days, you know our country is experiencing events that are shaping history right before our eyes. What we are witnessing is truly unprecedented, and yet through it all, God has us all in His hands. Now, there's no doubt the news will be definitely fixated on election matters right up through the 5th of November. But you know, there are still many other events occurring that require our attention as well. All the while, families are struggling to make ends meet, and there's a spiritual war raging now more than ever before. So how do we discern the signs of the times? Today here on Family Talk, our own Gary Bauer, Senior Vice President of Public Policy here at the Dr. James Dobson Family Institute Policy Center, is joined by Michele Bachmann, a familiar voice here on Family Talk, a former Congresswoman and a member of our JDFI board. Together, they'll be discussing recent events through a spiritual lens, and they'll share that there is something larger going on. So turn up the volume and join me as we now turn our attention to Gary Bauer and Michele Bachmann right here on Family Talk.
Hello, everyone. I'm Gary Bauer, the Senior Vice President of Public Policy here at the James Dobson Family Institute. I'm also the host of the Defending Faith, Family, and Freedom podcast here at the JDFI, and I am honored to serve alongside my good friend of many years, Dr. James Dobson. Now, the summer is supposed to be sort of a quiet time in America. We go on vacation, things sort of slow down. Well, not this summer. It has been a dramatic summer full of earth-shattering events, some of them very troubling. Of course, the assassination attempt on former President Donald Trump, which narrowly missed being an incredible tragedy. Then not much after that, President Biden, in spite of his protests previously that he would not consider dropping out of the race, in fact, dropped out and will not accept the nomination of his party. He was under a great deal of pressure. We all read and saw that. And then in very quick order, the vice president emerged as the new nominee. And then I don't know how much national news it made. It certainly was big news here in Washington, D.C. We had a visit from the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu. Israel is one of America's most important allies. We have been connected to Israel for decades, since the modern nation of Israel was established. And there were tumultuous events in Washington when he arrived in the city, including some things almost unimaginable as far as the hatred that was evident on the streets of the nation's capital. So how do we sort through all of that? As you know, JDFI is committed to helping you be a good Christian citizen. This election coming up is extremely important. As we've said over and over again, it is impossible for America's problems to be solved without the active involvement of the followers of Jesus Christ. So today, we've invited to be our guest, somebody that you know very well, our colleague, Michele Bachmann, the Dean of the Robertson School of Government at Regent University. Michele is also a member of the Board of Directors for the Dr. James Dobson Family Institute and is a longtime friend of Dr. Dobson. She brings a particularly important perspective on issues related to Israel because, she, among other things, she's the co-chair of the Jerusalem Prayer Breakfast. Michele, there are so many things I want to talk to you about today. Dr. Dobson and his wife Shirley send you their best regards, and very glad as always to be with you.
Well, thank you, Gary. It's always a thrill to be with you as well, my brother. And Dr. James Dobson and Shirley Dobson are longtime supporters of Israel. And the reason why they are is because of what the Bible says about Israel. We are all told in Genesis 12:3 that those who bless Israel will be blessed, and those who curse Israel will be cursed. That is part of the covenant that God gave. And the covenant goes from Genesis all the way through Revelation. It doesn't apply merely to individuals. The covenant also applies, in this admonition to bless Israel, to nations. And so we see before our eyes those nations that curse Israel, they exist under cursing. And nations who bless Israel and the Jewish people, they experience blessing. And so that's in part why we're here today. We're in the midst of, as you stated so well, Gary, some of the most important historic events that we have never seen before in the United States. You had mentioned a little bit about my background. I was also a former member of the United States Congress.
Right.
I sat on the House Intelligence Committee. We dealt with the classified secrets of our nation. We dealt in particular with terrorism. And what we have seen during this summer, in about a 25-day period, certainly in less than a month, we have seen such a strong level of events that we couldn't imagine that it's just, quote, somehow coincidental. I'm not trying to create conspiracy when I say that, but I think it's important for the people who are listening to the James Dobson Family Institute to family talk, to unpack a little bit these extraordinary events so we can see how profoundly unusual this is and not succumb to deception and delusion, and to look not just at what the media says, but take 3 steps back and look at what's actually happened in the United States during this last month.
Well, Michele, that's a great way to start out. And by the way, I don't know why I didn't think about mentioning your time in Congress. You know, Michele, all those years you were in Congress, I don't remember ever having to say to somebody on my staff, well, check how Michele voted. You always voted for faith, family, and freedom, and for a strong national defense, all the things that we stand for and that Dr. Dobson and Shirley have stood for over the years. You know, this whole question about God speaking in a declarative sentence, we, as Christians, we tend to listen up when that happens. And you're right, the Bible's very clear about the Jewish people being covenant people. Let's take a second, and as we get into sort of parsing all the things that happened in recent weeks, the assassination attempt on former President Trump. Michele, as you know, President Trump was and still is an incredible supporter of the nation of Israel. And he moved the embassy to Jerusalem when he was president, doing what a lot of other presidents promised but never did. He and the prime minister were and are very close. So there's this terrible assassination threat, or this assassination attempt. And I believe that God's hand intervened and Donald Trump was spared from being killed in that assassination attempt. The reason I think it's so important to begin with this is I've heard from reporters that they can't even comprehend the idea that God would be involved in the affairs of men like this. So, of course, they don't believe God has blessed the Israeli people. They don't even believe that God has blessed America and the American people. So why don't we begin with how you first heard about the attempt on Trump's life and what you thought about it from a spiritual standpoint?
Well, actually, I was attending a play in St. Paul, Minnesota with my husband, and it was about the great Christian intellectual and author C.S. Lewis. We were in that play watching it when a friend of mine had texted me saying Trump was shot. And I jumped up out of my seat. I went out into the lobby and I immediately looked at the news sources and saw what had happened. And I grabbed the hands of 2 other believers who were standing in the lobby, and we began praying immediately for President Trump. By that point, his life had already been miraculously spared by the hand of God. And how do we know this? President Trump himself said that. Immediately after this event, President Trump had tweeted on his site, Truth Social. He had posted saying, fear not, the biblical admonition, fear not. And his first response was, this was completely the hand of Almighty God who had saved him. He understand. If the media doesn't understand this, President Trump understood that it was only a miracle that saved his life. He was at a rally in Butler, Pennsylvania, speaking to tens of thousands of Trump supporters. This was a very hot Saturday afternoon. He was speaking, and he was talking about the illegal immigration that is happening in the United States. He had a chart that Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin had given to President Trump. It was a chart that was put together by the Border Patrol. And President Trump was talking about this issue. And the shooter had pulled the trigger. Shots were coming at President Trump, intended to be kill shots, to kill him in the head and take him out. When President Trump, who was referring to the chart, he looked over his right shoulder in a fraction of a second, he turned his head to the right. And in that brief amount of time that seems inconsequential, but was consequential in saving his life, in that slight turn of his head, that allowed the bullet to penetrate his right ear instead of his brain in the right side of his head. He surely would have been killed in that moment. His instincts were to immediately drop down, which in itself, that was a second miracle, that his body immediately went down to the ground as he put his hand up to his right ear. And then Secret Service that were surrounding the platform, we saw them immediately do a pile-on of his body to put their bodies over President Trump's body to prevent any further bullets from hitting the president. As we know, tragically, a firefighter who was 55 years old was killed in that volley of bullets,
Yes.
and 2 other Americans were also hit and critically injured, but one was killed. That was an assassin's bullet. That was an attempt at an assassination. So we are not here to be conspiratorial. We are not here suggesting a conspiracy. But I think, Gary, in the context of this discussion you and I are having today, we need to go back a little bit before that Saturday on July 13th, because on June 27th, just 2 weeks before, President Biden and former President Trump met in Atlanta for the first debate. Never before has there ever been a presidential debate held that early, but in this case, that was. President Biden agreed to the debate on June 27th. Many of our listeners tuned into that debate in Atlanta, and many Democrats said this was a very poor performance on the part of President Biden. But President Biden said immediately afterwards, the next day, he said, well, I'm going to continue in this campaign. When you get knocked down, you get back up. And so just several days after that, 5 days, the first Democrat member of Congress called for President Biden to withdraw from the race. Then dozens of Democrats starting to call from him to get out of the race. Well, on July 5th, President Biden insisted he would remain in the race. And he said this, and I quote, if the Lord Almighty came down and said, Joe, get out of the race, I get out of the race. The Lord Almighty's not coming down. That's what the president said on July 5th. And then several days later, more additional Democrats called on him to get out of the race. Then when President Biden was on Morning Joe's show on July 8th, he said, I'm not going anywhere. And all the Democrat leaders, the Black Caucus, the progressives, different leaders said, yeah, we're sticking with Joe Biden. And then Joe Biden went to NATO. If any of our listeners remember, he went to NATO in Europe and he spoke and he gave a news conference. It didn't go very well. And he said, I've got to finish the job because there's so much at stake. 2 days after his disastrous NATO press conference, where he didn't do very well, 2 days later, that's when the assassination attempt happened in Pennsylvania. Again, we're not here suggesting a conspiracy. We're just giving the timeline of events. We've never seen a presidential candidate give a debate performance as poor as was given by President Biden. And that, again, was on June 27th. And this is about 2 weeks later when the assassination attempt occurred. So what happened after the assassination attempt? That was on Saturday, Gary, if you remember. On July 15th, President Biden gave an interview with Lester Holt from NBC News. He declared he's not leaving the presidential contest, and he said he's staying in. That's the day President Trump announced J.D. Vance of Ohio would be his running mate. So then on July 15th, that's when President Biden weirdly, mysteriously tested positive for COVID. This was very strange, Gary, because there's not a COVID outbreak in America. There's no one more isolated than Joe Biden. He's been on the beach in Delaware. He's been very isolated. And yet, if you look at the world data on COVID, for Canada, only 8 people out of 1 million have had COVID. In Mexico, only 3 people out of 1 million have had COVID. In Puerto Rico, no one out of 1 million has had COVID. And the only country in the world in the month of July that didn't post any statistics on COVID is America. So, but somehow our president came down with COVID, forcing him into isolation. So our president went into isolation. And during that time, we had President Trump then on July 18th formally accept the nomination of the Republican Party. And then we started to have members of Biden's family say that they were in discussion with Democrat leaders about Joe Biden exiting the race. So this is very, very strange. And then over the weekend on Sunday, the 21st of July, right after the successful Republican convention, then we didn't see Joe Biden. We were told he had COVID. He was on the beach in Delaware. And he announced in a tweet that he was getting out of the presidential race. And then a half hour, another tweet came out. And that tweet said that he was endorsing Kamala Harris. And within 24 hours of Joe Biden issuing a tweet, no one's ever seen this before. This has never happened in politics. Within 24 hours of the president of the United States saying he's going to suspend his campaign for the presidency, Kamala Harris, the vice president, hadn't announced she was running for president. She didn't announce. But President Biden said that he's fully endorsing Kamala Harris without her even announcing. So he announces, and within 24 hours, all the leaders of the Democrat Party in the different states all came together, including 2,600 delegates to the Democrat convention. Well, hundreds more than would be needed to secure the nomination for Kamala Harris. They all came out and said they support her. In other words, they'd had the convention, they'd nominated her, it was over, and over $100 million came in for her reelection. This is shocking. No one saw President Biden, and yet mysteriously all Democrats came forward. And so this was a fait accompli. She is now the presumptive nominee for the Democrat Party. And then the Democrat Party announced that they're on August 7th going to hold basically a Zoom call, and they're going to agree that they're going to nominate her on a Zoom call. And when they finally have their convention on TV, she will already be the nominee. It'll be done. And basically, it'll be a 4-night rock concert where you'll see the most famous entertainers in the world. And it'll be a big show on TV of we're united, we're united, we're united. So in less than 1 month's time, we go from a disastrous debate performance by the Democrat nominee, President Biden, to an assassination attempt on President Trump. He survives the assassination attempt, and someone, some way, despite President Biden saying, no, I'm going to drop out, he drops out. Kamala Harris is the new nominee, and then President Biden goes on TV and he states that he's dropping out because of democracy. He wants to preserve democracy. and he wants to give the nomination to a younger person, when just 3 days before he said there's no way he's dropping out. None of this makes sense. I went to Washington, D.C., Gary. We'll talk a little bit more about Benjamin Netanyahu and his fabulous speech that he gave in Washington, D.C. I traveled to Washington, D.C. to be in the chamber when he gave that speech. I can, as a former member of Congress, I can be in the chamber. And I talked to a number of members of Congress, and their heads were spinning. They said in politics, they have never seen more historic events that they had seen in the month prior. And that's why I think it's so important that we're here today, Gary, because if members of Congress who are deeply involved in politics are saying this is the weirdest month of events they've ever seen, I think it's important that we're spending this time unpacking for the benefit of the listeners to Family Talk these events and what it means for biblical believers in this very important election year.
Well, I think you're absolutely right, Michele, that and that's what we're trying to do is see if it's difficult for the professionals, the elected officials, to parse all this, to dig into it and understand what the forces are that are at work here. Imagine how difficult it is for the average American family trying to pay their bills and keep their kids safe. And we know from studies and research that 3/4 of the country think we're headed in the wrong direction, that America's in deep trouble, that our best days are probably behind us instead of ahead of us.
Well, yeah, there's so many questions, Gary, because immediately after the assassination attempt, all of the strange information came out that law enforcement knew about the shooter. They had photos and video of the shooter an hour before the event. The Secret Service director couldn't answer or refused to answer questions before Congress, forcing her to resign. The FBI director before Congress admitted that he knows of at least 2 FBI agents who said they had hoped that the shooter would have been successful and would have killed President Trump. We've never seen anything like this before in the United States. And so there's all these questions that the American people have. Can we trust our government? What's happening? And so much is at stake. So much is on the table right now. That's why it is important. We're not here because of politics or Democrat, Republican. We're here again because we love the Lord. We love the Bible. We believe that biblical values bring about success in a nation. And in fact, Psalms 33 says, as you know, Gary, blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. And so that's why we're here today. We want to talk about how these biblical values can be lived out in our country freely and what's happening at the highest levels in our country. Will we be allowed to have a biblically based nation or not? And so it's important that we talk about these ideas.
Well, what a firebrand discussion indeed here on Family Talk. You've been listening to Gary Bauer, Senior Vice President of Public Policy here at the Dr. James Dobson Family Institute, and former Congresswoman and current JDFI board member Michele Bachmann. They've been discussing many current events and looking at them through the lens of Scripture. By the way, if you'd like to keep up with election issues in your area, we urge you to check out myfaithvotes.org. This is a nonprofit organization founded by Celia Yates back in 2015 in order to help reach Christian voters. You know, millions of Christians are registered voters, but they don't exercise their right to vote in presidential elections. Millions of other Christians just sit out altogether. They're not even registered. If we as believers are willing to stand together for biblical truth as we cast our votes, we can and will make a difference. So go to myfaithvotes.org. You'll find that link up at drjamesdobson.org. And be sure to keep an eye out for Decision 2024 resources from the Dr. James Dobson Family Institute and the Dobson Policy Center as well. Let's see how much of a positive impact we can make during this election season. You know, culture is all around us. We can't escape it, and it's going off the deep end. But there is a way for us as Christians to stand for truth in the public square. Here at the Dr. James Dobson Family Institute, we've established the new Dobson Culture Center to help equip families and individuals develop a stronger biblical foundation. Now, the ultimate mission of the DCC is to strengthen the church by teaching that a biblical worldview is the cornerstone for marriage, parenting, and preserving human dignity. If we as believers stand for truth, even when it's tough to do, we can have a positive impact on culture and provide hope and a better future for generations to come. Now, you can visit the Dobson Culture Center by clicking the Culture Center tab at the top of our homepage at drjamesdobson.org. And while you're there, stay up to date with content and resources from the DCC by signing up for the free Lighting Up Culture Weekly Report. Now, you can do so when you go to drjamesdobson.org and click the Culture Center tab at the top of the homepage. Or you can click the link on the bottom of today's broadcast page at drjamesdobson.org/Family Talk. I'm Roger Marsh. Thanks so much for joining us today here on Family Talk, and be sure to join us again tomorrow for part 2 of Gary Bauer and Michele Bachmann's look at what's happening in the world today. They'll share more about the recent visit of Prime Minister Netanyahu from Israel and much, much more. You won't want to miss it, so join us again Friday for another edition of Dr. James Dobson's Family Talk.
This has been a presentation of the Dr. James Dobson Family Institute.